Did you hear that? All of you wear them, right? But then, when we say, I'll throw a slipper at you, it has a different connotation. This title, which we're going to explore today, is Chapal Rani, the last Queen of Bengal, the life and times of a female impersonator. Chapal is a homonym here. It may have nothing to do with the actual name. But today, we are proud and delighted to have the author of this book, Sandip Roy, who is none other than the only child of the famous Indian director Satyajit Roy and Bijoya Roy. Put your hands together for Sandip Roy.
I'm not.
You're not? Oh, anyway. But he's here, and his book, which is all of 475 pages, is with us. And we're going to hand over the mic and the stage to Sandip Roy to take us through the world of Indian cinema. Please welcome Sandip Roy.
Sorry if you were expecting Satyajit Ray's son. I'm a different Sandip Roy, but I don't make films. But I hope I don't make films. But I hope I will be able to entertain you a little bit this morning on Valentine's Day, which you have chosen to spend here at the festival. This is actually my first time that this book has come out last month in January, and this is the first time I'm doing a real presentation on it. Before that, there were sort of interlocution on stage with the moderator asking questions, and this time, and I don't really have a slideshow or something which people often have for presentations, so I'll try and tell you as a story about this remarkable man called Chapal Rani, or why he became known as Chapal Rani. The other thing I want to say is that usually in these sessions, we talk and then there's some time set aside for questions. In this case, we'll do that, but if you have any questions if something comes up during the thing where you feel like, okay, what does that mean, or you have a comment, feel free to put your hand up. We can keep it as interactive as possible. So let me set the scene Brian showed you the cover. This is this person known as Chapal Rani. But one time, he was born as a man called Chapal Bhaduri, a man, and just became famous as Chapal Rani. But how did Chapal Bhaduri become Chapal Rani? So to tell that story, you have to sort of go back to the world of theater in Bengal, Jatra, which is the folk traveling theater. And what was that world like? So let me read a little bit from it. Okay. There was a field in our village called the Jatra field. During the monsoons, when no Jatras happened, we would play in the mud. But during Jatra time, a stage would be built with wooden planks in the middle of the field. They'd put up bamboo poles and make a roof of sorts with tarpaulin. Wooden planks on both sides were the ramps. That was our theater. Big bulbs tied to the poles bathing the stage in a yellow glow. That was our lighting. 1 or 2 chairs, bas, nothing more, no scenery, no props, no sets. But on Jatra night, that was enough to create magic. The musicians would sit below the stage. Drums, cymbals, bells, clarinet, harmonium, flute, maybe a couple of trumpets. When the music went peh, 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 people would start streaming in from all the villages around us. A river of people all jostling to find a seat. The women on one side of the stage, the men on the other. other three, and us children squeezed in wherever we could, all our faces sweaty with excitement. The actors' faces caked with makeup and grease paint, with white lead and lamp soot, shone in the light of the Petromax lamps around which hundreds of insects buzzed. My mother's favorites were the jatras about gods and goddesses. I had a weakness for the historical ones, whether about kings and queens or English sahibs and freedom fighters. Those had more fighting. I liked that. But most of all, I liked to watch the jatra queens. That was the real magic. We would hang around the makeshift dressing room and try to peep through the faded velvet curtains with names of the Jatra company written on them. Inside would be big metal trunks full of costumes. The actors would be standing around gossiping, doing their makeup, some of them half-dressed, looking like half kings and half gods. I would fantasize running away with them, traveling all over the country. How exciting that would be. What shows they were. When Chapal Rani came on stage, I would get goosebumps. Once he was a queen in armor. Another time he showed up in a dress to seduce a rebel chieftain. That had all the menfolk in the village whistling. What shows they were. The trumpets would sound their fanfare, the drums would start beating, and Chapal Rani's voice would rise higher and higher, traveling to the end of the field, as clear as a bell. I have seen him as a princess, and I've seen him as the queen mother. I have seen him crush men with a look, and I have seen him cry his eyes out. I have seen him die on stage as someone stabbed him with a knife. The actresses Suchitra Sen and Shupriya Devi, the leading ladies from films, were not stars in our village. They might as well have been stars in the sky. The Jatra queens were right there. We could almost smell the powder they used. So that's the sort of setting of what Jatra is like. And what about Chapal Rani? What happened was in the 1930s, 40s, when these Jatras are roaming around the countryside, women were not allowed to perform in them because this was traveling theater, and women from so-called respectable families couldn't spend like 6 months on the road, traveling around with this company, sleeping, in huts and on the field and stuff like that. So men played women. And because they played women so successfully, they became known as Ranis. So Chapal Bhaduri becomes Chapal Rani, Shatodal Rani, Chobi Rani. They all became famous as Rani, and sometimes they became as famous as any leading lady in a film. So a Jatra would be built on the power of that star couple, whoever was the lead and whoever was the Rani. And Chapal became, the interesting thing is, in the 1950s, Chapal Rani starts acting. He's just a teenager. He's a sort of effeminate boy. He starts acting female roles just to make a living. And then he becomes so famous that every year his salary is going up. His name is up on top. He's become the most famous Rani around till it suddenly all ends because now women are coming into Jatra themselves. They are starting to play the roles of the heroine, the mothers and stuff. But for a while, Chapal Rani still persists. Like there is a woman playing the leading heroine in the film, in the Jatra, and Chapal Rani might be playing the mother's role, or the evil mother-in-law, or whatever is going on. So I wanted to give you a little sense of what Chapal Rani was like in his heyday. And so we have a short little video which we'll play. Yeah, better. As you can see, we did this video because Chapal Rani I spent about 5 years almost working on this book, interviewing him. At that time, he was fairly mobile. He would come every week to the Seagull bookstore and sit down and talk to me for several hours about his life. But a couple of years ago, he had a stroke and so was bedbound and is bedbound right now. So sadly, he couldn't come to his own launch in Kolkata. So we took the book to him before the launch, and he was very excited. That's where so we did a little film to show that he's still around and is, he can't really, he's not mobile, but his brain is still very sharp. And as you can see in the beginning of that clip, he actually still can recite entire pages of dialogue just from memory. He's just like, then he'll recite like for 2 minutes, he'll be reciting dialogue, and then he'll suddenly stop and say, oh, I don't remember the next line, and then shake his head and say, oh, my memory is going, now I'm like in my 80s. I'm like, you just recited 2 pages of dialogue from a jatra you did in 1962. I can't even remember things I did the beginning a few months ago. So that's pretty amazing. But his story is itself sort of amazing, which is why I started telling it and discovering more about it. He comes from a family that was devoted to theater. His uncle was sort of the great theater king of Bengal, Shishir Bhaduri, and he'd started his own theater company. His mother Prabha Devi was an actress who became one of the leading actresses on stage as well as film in her time, and she was like legendary for these roles. So Chapal grows up as a little boy, literally sitting in the wings of the theater and watching the great actors and actresses of their time perform on stage. And his sort of earliest memory of acting is his mother is acting in a play where there is a little boy, and some little boy is playing her son in that play. One day this boy is sick and can't come. So Chapal's at their home, and somebody says like, oh, your mother has called you and asked you to come to the theater. And so he goes to the theater, and he's asked to fill in for this boy, and all he has to do is sort of come out on stage. The mother says something, and then he goes to another person. He really doesn't have much dialogue, but he has like 30 seconds on stage. But he says he was so excited by it, and then after that he gets 5 rupees for his labor. So it's like the first money he's earned. He's like 4 or 5 years old at this time. He goes home holding this 5 rupees and he never wants to spend it because it's his first earning. And the other remarkable thing about the mother is that she, like many actresses, was not regarded as very respectable in Kolkata's Bengali society at that time. She had had a long-term relationship with a man before that and had 3 children with him. That man refused to marry an actress. So in the end, she breaks up with him. She gets involved with another man, that Shishir Baduri's brother, and who's a widower. They marry, sort of, because it's not really accepted by his family. She has 3 children by him, one of whom is Chapal, and his sister Ketoki, who also becomes an actress. So she lives in this one house with these 6 children from 2 different relationships and her husband. So in that time, in the 1950s, she buys her own house in Kolkata with her own money. So her husband is actually living in her house. She, unlike most women, is not living in her husband's house. So she like really holds this family together. But then at the age of 58 or something, she just dies, drops dead one morning. She has a heart attack. She dies. Chapal is like 12 years old. He's taken out of school. There's nobody really to. Father is sort of an alcoholic. Nobody there to look after them. The kids are somehow, he sort of bounces around between his various siblings. Some days one sister takes care of him, some days another. And around when but he's desperate to make money because there's no income in the house. One sister is an actress. She does, she brings in some money. One brother is, I think, a bus conductor. So one of his brother-in-law works in the railways, and the brother-in-law tells him, Chapal is always a sort of effeminate boy. And the brother-in-law says, like, do you think you can act as a woman? And he's like, what? Like as a girl? He says, yeah, our railway company is putting together this play on the Alibaba's play, basically, the Alibaba and the 40 thieves. And we're looking for someone to play the part of Murjina, the slave girl in the play. So that began, he's like, oh, really? And he's like, you don't have to worry. They'll do everything. They'll do your hair, makeup, costumes and stuff. So that is the first time he acts as a woman on stage, and as a result of that, he actually gets a job in the railways, because the railways keeps putting on these productions and they keep needing people to play these parts. So he gets a job as something called a fitter or something like that. Like it's got a chain man is his job. So he has to measure things on the railway. But he says, I never went out to do any of that work because I couldn't go out in the sun. It would burn my complexion, and they needed me to look fair and pretty for all the women I would have to keep playing on stage. So he gets a railways job, which is a very coveted job at that time, just to play women in all their sort of stage productions. That ends, and then eventually he starts acting in sort of community theater, and then eventually he enters the world of commercial jatra, which which you could see, which is huge at that time. And he gets a salary, and he's thrilled because he gets a salary, and he's mostly thrilled because he gets to, the meals are included. He's like, I get 2 meals a day, I get paid, like I can't ask for anything better. And I thought that, when we're talking about how does this man who is, you saw him right now, and when you look at him, he's not particularly womanly looking. He's got a square face, he's kind of stocky. How did this man so convincingly play a woman? So that's part where I asked him about that, like how did you transform yourself into a woman? So I thought I'd read a little bit of what he said. And he talks about hair, makeup, and all voice, but then he talks about breasts, because, as a woman on stage, he has to look convincing. So he says, what is a woman without breasts? When I began, we just had little mounds of rags that were held in place by cloth and then tied at the back. We had no bras or bodices, but if you tied it correctly, it would not shift while acting, and you could wear a blouse on top of it. But an actor once told me he hated to embrace me on stage. My breasts were too hard. They poked when he bumped against them. So I went to Newmarket to find the right kind of sponge and stuffed that in little pouches. It looked a bit like the masks people wore on their faces during COVID. Those became my breasts. In Chottosri, I played Jharna, daughter of a minister in a royal court. She was in love with a military commander named Muktoporno. Muktoporno joins the service of a rival king and comes to fight against his former kingdom. And then there's a little bit of, he basically could recount all the dialogue from his plays, all the parts. So this is as he recounts it. Jharna says, I thought you loved me. You've given my father your word that you will marry me, and now you have come to do battle against my father, siding with the enemy. What kind of love is this? Muktoporno says, love is love, but I cannot go against my duty. Jharna, I will not stand for this. You cannot come against us like this. Let's make a wager. Let's see how many soldiers you can slay, and let us see how many I can. Muktoporno, Jharna, what are you saying? You're a woman and you will come into the battlefield. Jharna, yes, I will. And I will go in such a fashion that every soldier will be so dazzled by my beauty, they will rush towards me like moths drawn to a flame. And as they fight among themselves, I will kill them with my own hands. What a scene that was. I made the sponge breasts a little larger than usual, exactly like 2 halves of a coconut. After I fixed them on myself with spirit gum, you could hardly tell they were artificial. I painted my body the same color as the breasts because I had to perform that scene bare-bodied. Then I draped a very fine red, almost sheer Banarasi cloth around myself so that if I leaned forward, the cloth would slip and reveal my cleavage. In those days, electric lights had not come to Jatra. That cleavage, lit by the glow of Petromax lamps, would drive the audience absolutely wild. And this was so convincing at that time that he says that, people would really sometimes mistake these actors for real women. So in one play, he is playing a young woman who's been raised as an unmarried girl in her rich father's house. Then she finds out that she was once married, her husband is dead. So then she has to exit and change from her green silk sari into a widow's white cotton. And that dress would be ready in the green room. At a performance in Jamshedpur, I was on my way to the green room to change my sari when suddenly I felt like I was floating in the air. Before I even realized what had happened, some strapping young men had grabbed me, picked me up, and deposited me in their jeep. The organizers and stagehands came rushing out shouting, "Stop, stop, what are you doing?" The men had thought I was a real woman and decided to abduct me. A tug-of-war ensued. The Jatra people were holding onto my left arm while my love-struck kidnappers hung tight to the other. "I am going to take you home with me," said one. "Come with me, darling, marry me," said another. But this is our actor. He's a man, protested one of the members of our troupe. No, no, that cannot be. Finally, I had to take off my wig to prove that I was actually a man. By then, I was entirely disheveled. My clothes were torn, my makeup a mess. Somehow, I managed to pull myself together and finish my performance. After that incident, whenever the green room was at some distance from the stage, I would insist that someone accompany me there. Another time while acting in Plabon, blinded by all the lights, I tripped and fell and broke my wrist. I was rushed to Bangur Hospital in South Kolkata, groaning in pain. I was still in a sari because I had no time to change. The medical staff took one look at me and tried to send me to the maternity ward, convinced I was having labor pains. I had to curse at them and scream for my wig to be taken off. Now it seems funny. At that time, it didn't feel that way. So, this is sort of the life they had, and at their height and fame and fortune, and not unique to him. A lot of other Jatra queens had similar experiences. Then comes, as I was saying, the fall, where women are coming into Jatra and there's no role for them anymore. And one of the big things that is happening now in the 1960s is mics are coming into Jatra. So before, when you would perform on a field and you had 10,000 people around you on all four sides, even if you were doing the most romantic scene, your voice had to carry to that last person in the last row. And in general, that's why the women's voices were softer and they couldn't do that. So they needed the men to play these women's roles. And the other thing you have to remember, unlike a stage where I'm like standing here in front of you and talking, but you can't see, you're not behind me, you're all in front of me. In the Jatra stage traditionally was in an open field, so there was audience on all sides. So people had to keep pivoting, had to keep remembering that there was audience behind them. And there's a famous anecdote he tells me where they're doing a stage with some play with Siraj Uddullah or something, and this person is going to strike them with a sword. It's a very dramatic scene. So he does it, but then the people behind say, but we didn't see it. So then he, without missing a beat, the Jatra person and they all had to swivel around and do it all over again so that the people on the other side could see the person being killed right now. So as Jatra becomes more like theater, it becomes easier to bring women into the field. And soon he realizes that it's not just like Chapal Rani would tell me that he was fine with women coming into the Jatra. He just thought and assumed that he would still have a place alongside them. And for a while, he did. But then came 1974. Work was drying up. I suddenly got a call from Kamala Opera. It's not a well-known company. I'd once worked in famous grade 1 theater groups. This was more like grade 3, the kind where they don't even give you a salary. You were just paid a daily wage after each show. I was offered the role of the heroine's mother, an older woman, widowed, somewhat villainous. It was not a glamorous role by any means, but it was a meaty role, and I grabbed at it. Women were now commonplace, even in Jatras. This play too had a woman in the cast. The heroine was a new actress. Men like me, who had made a living playing women, were finding it harder and harder to get roles. But I didn't know how to do anything else. I was grateful to be offered any role. One day we'd gone for a show at the Pyari Mohan College in Uttarpara. This is probably my 6th or 7th night with that play. I was delivering my lines when someone in the audience hurled a clay cup, like the kind you have tea in, onto the stage. At first, I had no clue what was going on. I couldn't figure out what the problem was. As people started shouting and screaming, it slowly dawned on me that I was the problem. The audience didn't want to see me on stage. They wanted to see a real woman. There was a cinema actor in the audience that evening. He tried to calm them down, reason with them, tell them who I was. But they didn't care. They said Chapal Rani might have been Chapal Rani at one time. But that was then. Now we want a real woman. Bring us a real woman. They didn't want to see a man play a woman on the stage anymore. Those days were over. There had been many before. Sure. Sure. Sure, sure.
Sit over there on the stage. On the stage is good. Also, one or two want to sit over there. Sit on the stage. Ready. Go ahead. Sit on the stage. Okay. Sit over here. Wait. Are you showing things?
No, we finished the screen. We finished the screen. So for those who came in right now, welcome. And I'm telling people the story of a man named Chapal Rani who became very famous in Bengal for playing the part of women on stage. So what I was reading was a little bit from the book where it's one of his last performances as a woman on stage, and by then women are acting in those parts. So he comes on stage and somebody throws a clay cup at him. So there had been many before me, like Chobi Rani, Babli Rani, and Rakhal Rani, who had made a name for themselves playing women on stage in Jatra. We were so famous, we were all called Rani or Queen. It seemed like I was destined to be the last queen of Jatra. The age of Chapal Rani was over. There was nothing to be done. In desperation, the organizers asked one of the actresses in the troupe if she would step in and take over the role for me. It was going to be tough at such short notice, and it wasn't a small part either. She said she would try her best. I explained what little I could to her, and that was it. There was nothing left for me to do. Once audiences had worshipped me when I played Chand Bibi or Sultana Rizia or Queen Koikei. Now I had to leave the theater in shame, burning with humiliation, tears stinging my eyes. They called me Chapal Rani, Queen of Jatra. But this was not an exit worthy of any queen. I vowed I would never wear a sari again. I was 35 years old. So then Chapal Rani basically disappears. There are no parts for him. He has nothing to do. He starts living in his sister's house, almost like a glorified house help. And he talks about those years, struggling. And then eventually he ends up on the street playing goddesses. So there were these sort of things where people would dress up as goddesses and go around the streets begging for money, singing the songs of the goddesses. And, people would give 10 rupees, 5 rupees, whatever. And that is how he was making some kind of income for a few days of the month. Then what happens is in the late 90s, Seagull, which is produces, Naveen Kishore was the founder, does a series of photographs of him, which are included in the book also, of him sort of transforming himself into this goddess, Shitala, sitting in his makeup. He makes a documentary on him, and suddenly a whole new generation of people discover Chapal Rani, people who never watched Jatra, but they discover him as kind of this gender-bending, iconic figure. And then they discover even more stunningly in the documentary where Chapal Bhaduri talks quite openly about the fact that he had this decades-long relationship with a man who was married. For a while, Chapal lives in the same house as the man, his wife, and his children, who all call him Uncle C. And they all live together. So in a way, long before we had all these stories about LGBTQ and all of that in India, Chapal Rani was sort of a path-breaking icon, but he didn't realize it. Nobody else realized it about him. Then a bunch of plays and films start getting made on him. The famous Bengali director Ritupurno Ghosh does a film called Arekti Premer Golpo, which is based on Chapal's story, where Chapal plays himself, and Rituparno plays a younger version of him. That film goes around the world, and suddenly a sort of new generation have discovered Chapal Rani, and it's become sort of the rebirth of Chapal Rani. So how did I discover him? I'm not really somebody from the world of Jatra. I'm not an expert on it. But I was approached by Seagull as saying, like, do you want to tell this remarkable person's story? And I was interested partly because of this rise and fall, which had this dramatic arc. But I was also interested because I thought, look, this is a queer pioneer person who lives still in our midst, and very few people know about that aspect of him, because there were many other Ranis like him in Jatra. Some of them may have been queer, some of them may not. Most of them ended up getting married, having children and all of that. But in the 1950s, 1960s, Chapal resisted that. His sister tried to get him married off, and he said, no, I will not get married. And he says he paid somewhat of a price for it. Now he lives in an old age home. His sister is gone. His nieces sort of take care of him. They are in charge of him. But in general, he doesn't really have very many people around him in terms of immediate family. And sometimes I think that makes him feel sad and alone. But at the same time, I really, really admired the kind of spirit that he had, where he resisted these currents of change, pushing him towards some kind of social conformity without knowing anything about this. He said, I didn't know what LGBT meant. I didn't know these words at all. I just knew I was in a relationship with this man whom he had met when he was 18. The man was 22. He was a friend of the family. That's all I knew. I mean, like in India now, then, there was all this thing about transgender, drag queen. He knew none of these terms. Section 377, which criminalized homosexuality. He's like, I didn't know about it until it was read down from Indian law. And he said, by that time, I was, in my late 70s, people said, what do you think about it? And he said, I would say, well, now I'm in my late 70s, I live alone, so my shop has shut down long ago, so it doesn't matter to me what the law says anymore. But while the law was still there, he just kind of did his thing. But as I spent weeks and months listening to him tell different parts of his stories, I realized he's like a fabulous raconteur. He can tell enormously entertaining stories, but the contemporaries around him are gone. There's very few people I could interview about their recollections of him. There's some people have interviews and things that are there, but not the people are gone. And then I came up with this idea of trying to write this book both as his memoir, as his biography, but sort of interspersing it with fiction. So it becomes a mixture of fiction and non-fiction. And the fictional parts are told in the voices of people who might have encountered him in his life. So there is a part that is in the voices of the women who have come into Jatra at that same time. What did they make of this man who was at that time regarded as a better woman than they were, where people would actually say, well, you're a woman anyway, so what's the big deal about you acting as a woman on stage? But look at this man. This man is able to convince thousands of people every night he's a woman, and that's real acting. And those women were obviously very naturally quite annoyed by this. And there's a part that's in the voice of the other Ranis who didn't, who faded away. And as I researched them, I discovered that most of these other Rani, the ending was quite sad because they really got no respectability. They were regarded as sort of whatever, as long as they had their youth and beauty, they did their parts, and then everyone kind of forgot about them. So I read a little bit from one of those fictional interludes where it talks about the other Ranis. Chobi Rani, for all his beauty, Chobi Rani used to be known as the Elizabeth Taylor of Jatra. Chobi Rani, for all his beauty, had nothing in his old age. He would stitch petticoats and sell them in the market, never telling anyone who he was. Poni Rani was such a great actor that when he played a villainous role, people would throw their shoes at him. Yet he couldn't afford his blood pressure medicines at the end. Horipada Rani was so famous for his roles in Badshah Alamgir and Saiba, he had such a golden touch they would call him Jatra Lakshmi. In the end, he didn't have the money to take care of his family. His wife and son found him hanging from a tree one morning. He had tried several times before but failed. Once he threw himself into the river with a pot tied around his neck, but a fisherman saved him. Another time he tried to hang himself from a bamboo pole, but it broke. This time, he succeeded. So much for the glamorous life of the Jatra Ranis. That Kanchan did the right thing, leaving Jatra to drive a cycle rickshaw. Pulling a rickshaw, selling vegetables, running a tea shop, all that was better than the life of a Jatra Rani, if you ask me. I realized that too, but by then it was much too late for me. This is in the voice of another Rani. Now, there's no one I can talk to about that life anymore. For a while, I would keep in touch with some of the other Ranis I had known. We would get together for a cup of tea, talk about the old times. We would tease each other about the admirers we had. Now it's funny to think how we fought over them, stabbed each other in the back, competed for their attention, called each other names. Now, most of us are gone or too old to meet up. Our knees hurt. Some have high blood pressure, some high blood sugar. Even my wife is gone. There's no one to talk to about the life I'd once led. But then my daughter-in-law brings me my morning cup of tea, and I count my blessing. Are you done looking at that album? You can take it if you like. I really have no need for it anymore. That grandson of mine is very inquisitive, always poking around in my cupboard. I'm nervous he'll stumble upon the album. It's an album of pictures of him as a Rani. I'll just keep this one picture if I may. It will remind me of the old days. Sometimes even I can hardly believe it was real. Maybe when I'm long gone, my grandson will find it. He will surely not recognize me. Perhaps he will think it's some woman his grandfather once loved in secret. He won't be entirely wrong. So when I do, I felt like this was a story of a world that has been vanishing, and it's vanishing before our eyes. Jatra is still big in Bengal. It is still hugely popular, and a lot of people go to see it all the time. But these Jatra Ranis are part of its history. They will not come back, and they shouldn't come back because there's no real need for them anymore rather than any kind of nostalgia or sentiment. But that is what made it all the more compelling for me to document their story while sort of the last of the great Jatra Ranis was still around and able to tell the story in his own voice. But as I was I thought this would be he would sit there, I would stick a microphone in his face, I would, listen to what he had to say and just kind of transcribe it and we would be done. But as I listened to him talk, I realized that Chapal Rani and my stories and all our story, that there were so many points where what he was going through resonated with us as well. And so I'll just read a little bit about sort of my, how it changed me while telling his story. And I was talking to another director who had worked with him, who was a gay man who had directed a play where Chapal Rani starred. And in his later life, he would often do these plays, which were basically versions of his story. The character was always a man who had once played a woman on stage, and then, maybe he had gone thrown out of the job. Now he's remembering the old days. So this person, Rakesh, said, I'd seen his familial ups and downs. I know about his troubles. I watched him move to the old age home. And sometimes I felt that the time I spent with him was time spent with my own destiny. On the surface, Ghosh's reality is different from Chapal's. He has a life partner, a supportive family, he works in group theater. But as a person who is part of the sexual minority, how much more secure are we really, says Ghosh. In India, the government will not recognize my partner. And in the world outside, Donald Trump refuses to accept alternate sexuality. As a gay man, that question nags me too. My queer vocabulary is different from Chapal's. I come from privilege he never had. But ultimately, we are both creatures of the fringe, uncertain about what security the future holds for us. I came to Chapal to learn about the history of Jatra and the female impersonators who once ruled it. But I got a master class in resilience. The hurt, the slights, the betrayals remain. But as I spent time with him, I would notice how he had learned to paper over these cracks. His story was about the phoenix rising from the ashes. Once a queen, always a queen. When we talked, Chapal Bhaduri was always ready for his close-up. And he would keep telling me, you never saw me in my Jatra days. One shouldn't say this about yourself, but I looked so beautiful. Now look at me, I'm old and fat and I've lost my hair. If only you'd seen me then. And at first, this sort of lament for lost beauty would amuse me. It seemed like vanity of sort of an aging star. But then later I realized that the sadness was not that he'd once been beautiful and was no longer that person. It was that there was nobody could bear witness to that beauty. No pictures exist. When his relationship broke up, his partner kept all the pictures. So the pictures that you see are from somewhat later in his life, not when he was 21 or 22. He ruled Jatra, but no one around could attest to his beauty. There weren't even pictures. So all he had were these words. And I felt that as incomplete as it was, my job was to somehow bear witness to the thing that he had lost. So I had begun this project imagining Chapal Rani as an aging Jatra queen sitting in front of a mirror and talking into it. But slowly I understood there's no one mirror. That memory itself is a hall of mirrors. And none of the reflections are only true or untrue. In the documentary Chena Kintu Ojana, this Jatra expert says, there comes a moment when the great male queens saw themselves in the mirror and fell in love with the person in it. He felt that was the mysterious moment of transformation when the male actor became the female actor. When I went to ask Chapal about that, I realized that in the cramped little room of his old age home, there is no space for even a proper mirror. The only full-length mirror is on the wall outside the room next to the door. And when I looked into it, as I bade him goodbye, I saw not Chapal Bhaduri, but myself. Thank you so much. We have a few minutes, so happy to take any questions anybody has. Yeah.
So, good morning, sir. My name is Valini, and I'm a literature student, actually. So, I know for a fact that when you write books, it's like every book has its pros and cons, and they're like reviews that you get from people. So, my question to you is, when you were writing this book, I'm sure you might have faced a lot of criticism with people because we are living in a society which is still patriarchal. So till date, men accepting their feminism is something that people don't want to see. Either it's feminism, femininity, or something that's related to another gender that is not masculine enough for them. And when you, as a man yourself, are going to write on certain topics, I feel like you can get a lot of backlash. And if you did, can you please tell us how you dealt with it?
Sure, thank you. So to be honest, I didn't really get that much backlash because now we live in a world where, at least in certain circles, writing about these kinds of topics is almost regarded as, okay, it's sort of cool. It's you come to, and I'm here at a literature festival in Goa talking about it. So I'm really privileged that way. The backlash, compared to what he must have faced in his time as a young man, very effeminate. His voice is very high naturally. He's sort of effeminate in his movements and all of that. So as a young, effeminate person, he must have faced a lot more bullying, harassment about his femininity than anything else. And a director I talked to said, in a way, Jatra saved him because it gave him a stage where his effeminate bearings was actually sort of an asset. This is what, so then it gave him a kind of respectability. So people were like, oh, acha, even though they may have called him names and this and that, but in general they were like, okay, he is making money by being this effeminate man on stage. And if he didn't have that talent for acting and performing, I think life would have been much, much harder for him. But he managed to do it, and he would often tell me that the whole point of it was, like in Jatra, everything was very exaggerated. So the other female impersonator would all talk in a very sort of campy way. And his thing was like, no, my thing is to be as natural as possible as a woman, because I am not a drag queen. I'm not pretending to be I'm not a man pretending to be a woman. For that time that I'm on stage, I have to somehow convince all of you that you're actually watching a mother or a queen or a goddess or whatever it is. And then when it's over and I change into my kurta pajama, I'm back to being a man. And the fact that so many people kind of believed it is sort of a testimony to his skill. And so I believe the Jatra stage kind of saved this very effeminate boy from, who had only studied up to class 8, didn't have all this vocabulary we have now. Bill?
Thank you, Sandip. That was absolutely marvelous. I mean, I can't wait to read the book, but your performance itself was marvelous. And one thing I was really struck by as you were talking about that really poignant scene with the clay pot, where all of a sudden audiences no longer want the fiction of a woman on stage. They want the so-called real woman. And I love the fact that Chapal Rani insists that for those moments I'm on stage, I am in fact a real woman. But I was really struck by how your stylistic experiment, where you sort of flesh out the documentary moments with these sort of fictional interludes, in a way is a version of what Chapal Rani was doing. That there is a truth in fiction that Chapal Rani was insistent on in her performances, that you are also performing in the writing of the book. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because something that I've noticed increasingly with people is they imitate my nephew when he was 2 years old. He kept saying at that point, is it real? And if it's not real, if it's fiction, then it's somehow less. But fiction can be more. So can you talk about your choice then?
My choice was, it came about actually with one of the few interviews I was doing with people around him. And so Chapal had told me this story once where he goes to this is in his older age, he goes to a play and then suddenly someone is calling him, see, and he turns around and he sees it's the two daughters of the man who used to be his lover at one time. They haven't seen each other in 20 years or 30 years. And he says he talks to them, asks them how their father is and all of that. And he tells me that story. When I interviewed this one director later who knew him, Rakesh, who I read a bit about, he tells me that same story because he's also gone to that theater, but he tells me one extra detail. He says, so then I go to the theater, I'm a little late, and when I go, I find Chapal is like awash in tears. He's like, And because he suddenly, unexpectedly encountered these two young women who were his lover's daughter, and he suddenly, after so many years of bitterness, he suddenly remembers him again, and he's just weeping. And then he says, and then the moment comes to go on stage, and he's like back to being Chapal Rani. But I was just struck by the fact that he left out those tears in the story he told me. And then that's when I realized that there are so many of these gaps in all these stories. And I was like, how can I fill in these gaps? And then it struck me, like, how about looking at his stories from all the perspectives that we don't have? Because as what he's telling me is his version of the story, which is absolutely legitimate. But I wondered, what would a modern day drag queen performer make of Chapal Rani? So there is that character in the story. So it allowed me to bring in all these other perspectives into Chapal Rani's story and hopefully kind of enrich his stories. It's not about questioning his story, but to add more lenses into that story.
It's already past time. So we'd actually use this moment to thank Sandip for his brilliant presentation. And thank you for being with us.
The book is available. I'm around, happy to talk to anybody afterwards as well. So
Thank you very much. Have a lovely day and happy Valentine's Day.